whores in this house. There's some whores in this house. Whores in this house. There's some whores in this house. There's some whores in this house. There's some whores in this house. I said certified freak. 7 days a week. Wet ass P word. Make that pull-out game weak. Yeah, you effin' with some wet ass P word. Bring a bucket and a mop for this wet ass P word. Give me everything you've got for this wet ass P word.
Counsel, the case is submitted. We'll hear arguments next in Loretto against Teleprompter, Manhattan. Mr. Gruen, I think you may proceed whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chief Justice, members of the court. I'm here to argue for the preservation of one of our subordinate constitutional rights, namely the preservation of property. That constitutional right existed in its full sanctity. Excuse me, sir?
In that statement, are you conceding it's subordinate?
But not so subordinate that you can't prevail. Was that it?
I'm sorry?
Not so subordinate that you can't prevail.
I hope not, sir.
Argument by irony.
Last Thursday, the Supreme Court did what housing activists and people who generally give a fuck about other people were most afraid of, overturning the CDC's moratorium on evictions. I would be remiss if I said I didn't see this one coming. Of course, the conservative Supreme Court, all having ties to the Federalist Society, lifted the half-ass protections, keeping most but not all renters from undue subjugation tied to their economic precarities predating COVID-19. But at least these fucking pricks explained why in their majority opinion, so let's get into those details. After months of ongoing litigation surrounding the CDC eviction moratorium, the Supreme Court has presided in favor of landlords' constitutional right as a property owner to evict over the CDC's federal statutory authority to implement necessary measures for preventing transmission rates of a communicable disease. In the Supreme Court majority opinion, included this language. Despite the CDC's determination that landlords should bear a significant financial cost of the pandemic, many landlords have modest means. Fucking right. And preventing them from evicting tenants who breach their leases intrudes on one of the most fundamental elements of property ownership, the right to exclude. The Supreme Court rested their argument on a 1982 Supreme Court case, Loretto versus Teleprompter, Manhattan, where another slate of conservative judges ruled that the New York State's mandate that every tenant had the right to a cable line, a utility, was a government taking. A taking is when the government expropriates some or all private property for public use without just compensation or fair market price for taking said property. That typically infringes property owners' rights under the 5th or 14th Amendment. The decision made clear that any type of permanent physical occupation of private property by a public entity will constitute a taking that requires fair compensation, even if the area taken and the loss in value are minimal. In reality, just compensation in this situation might amount to a minimal sum of money, so the significance of this case is more theoretical than practical. Majority opinion writer Marshall wrote that any government incursion on a private property requires compensation if the incursion is permanent and physical. So, the physical occupation of tenants is inherently transient. That's the whole point of rentership. The CDC never said that landlords were forced to allow their non-paying tenants to live there forever and ever. They still have to pay every single outstanding amount of rent that they owe. And tenants aren't things, they are people who, if forcibly removed from their quarters, could result in very real damages to them physically, or the result in a loss of life. There is now multiple evidence suggesting that there is a direct relationship between evictions and excess COVID cases and deaths. But the Supreme Court failed to opine on the possible public health outcomes that lifting the ban would lead to. and focusing solely on the concrete evidence that non-paying of rent, huge fucking air quotes, was leading to irreparable damages to landlords financially. Because they absolutely could not think of ways that the government could further intervene to, cancel mortgage payments altogether, then pledge to reimburse landlords for the value of their tenant exploitation that they keep calling unpaid compensation for some reason. Instead, they just assume that the best thing to do is to reinforce landlord rights and evict their tenants to allow their units to sit completely vacant while millions of people are relegated to homelessness. There wasn't a lot of proof that they weighed their options here in considering if the right to uphold the violent legacy of property rights was maybe less important than the right to life, which, correct me if I'm wrong, is the foundation of the conservatives' pro-life arguments. The mental gymnastics required to interpret this 1982 Supreme Court case as applicable to our current unprecedented circumstances is cartoonishly evil. But the Supreme Court's blatant disregard for renters' lives was made unequivocally clear. They equated renters to objects. The Supreme Court also mentioned that regulations used in the 1944 Public Health Act had been generally limited to quarantining infected individuals and animals. If only a pandemic could have broken out before here and now to determine if the statute should have room for novel interpretations to a novel disease. They said this: indeed, the government's read on Section 361 of the Public Health Act of 1944 would give the CDC a breathtaking amount of authority. It is hard to see what measures this interpretation could place outside the CDC's reach. And the government has identified no limit in 361 beyond the requirement that the CDC deem a measure necessary. Could the CDC, for example, mandate free grocery delivery to the homes of the sick or vulnerable? Require manufacturers to provide free computers to enable people to work from home? Order telecommunication companies to provide free high-speed internet services to facilitate remote work? Well, no, you fucking assholes, they couldn't, because the institution's racist grandmas and grandpas that you literally just referenced set the precedent in 1982 that installing infrastructure for public utility purposes is considered a government taking. And we all know that the government budget falls short of helping the working poor, but God forbid the CDC call to utilize federal funding to do what the law originally intended it to do. Employ quarantine measures for infected people. It was actually a point you tried to make a little earlier about how the CDC reached beyond the parameters of this particular federal statute. It's actually the entire premise of your argument that banning evictions in an attempt to stop the very likely spread of the disease was a step too far, and that the CDC's role was limited to decontamination measures for those who had contracted the disease. What gives, Supreme Court? Sounds like you might be overreaching in your authority, dictating what is an acceptable government response to eliminate the spread of a deadly, highly transmissible disease. The court's refusal to open the scope of the original framework of the 1944 Public Health Act for nuance while jamming through a highly ambiguous, completely unrelated, irrelevant false dichotomy of private property torts to justify landlords' right to assassinate renters by proxy is the absolute epitome of property over people. The majority ended with these words: "It is indisputable that the public has a strong interest in combating the spread of COVID-19 Delta variant, but our system does not permit agencies to act unlawfully even in pursuit of desirable ends. It is up to Congress, not the CDC, to decide whether the public interest merits further action here." Well, guess what, motherfuckers? Congress ain't here. They skipped town. But I'm here, and I'm going to dispute your fallacious claims to evidence why public interest, simply based on what the numbers are telling us, does merit further action. And I have data to back it up. Claim number 1. Vaccine and rental assistance distribution had improved since the stay was entered, while the harm to landlords had continued to increase. Alright, let's look at the actual reach and the recipients of these measures. While it's true that the distribution of vaccines initially mitigated the spread of the original COVID-19 variant, the Delta variant has proven to be highly transmissible and has led to an influx of cases that we haven't seen since the numbers peaked in January of this year. And of course, states picked up the pace with some rental distribution, and we'll get into that a little later. Right now, I want to focus on how these circumstances haven't improved for one group in particular: the working poor. The Supreme Court makes no reference of the 14% national job loss that peaked in April 2020, or how jobs in specific industries paying lower wages have been incredibly slow to recover. Beyond complete job loss, pay cuts or essential employees contracting COVID-19 has exacerbated these precarities. Some workers were forced to quit their jobs because schools were shut down and it was more expensive to pay for childcare and continue to work than to stay at home and collect unemployment. There are tons of different variables here that exclusively apply to low-wage employees, but let's stick with indisputable facts. Data collected from the California Unemployment Office found that COVID-19 economic job loss hit non-white workers the hardest, with a slower re-entry back into the workforce. Even though some return to work, this doesn't mean they're square with their landlords either, if they still owe back rent from when they were unemployed, and federal rental assistance is pending. Another factor Supreme Court failed to consider are vaccine disparities. It turns out that roughly half of non-vaccinated populations are in households whose income is $50,000 or less. Researchers hypothesize that lower-wage employees may live further away from vaccine distribution sites, with operating hours that conflict with their working-class schedules. Let's control for the likely response from a COVID-19 vaccine denier, saying that maybe they don't want to get the vaccine. Not quite. An overwhelming number of unvaccinated individuals whose household income is less than $25,000 per year plan to either definitely or probably get the vaccine. And this isn't the only disparity worth noting. 60% of households who are very likely to experience eviction in the next 2 months also make less than $25,000 per year. So households that are most at risk for eviction, due to spatial inequities with distribution sites or due to unemployment, have the largest concentration of unvaccinated individuals. Claim number 2. The government has had 3 additional months to distribute rental assistance funds to help ease the transition away from the moratorium. Yeah, so the Supreme Court is clearly taking aim at the time period that could have gone toward pumping out rental assistance more effectively, but the states didn't fucking do that. They just didn't, and punishing tenants for their state's failure is acting with impunity, as if it's their faults. Their states couldn't get their shit together. The Supreme Court also seemed to heavily weigh the sliver of progress made in the last 2 months with rental aid. Even though assistance doled out in June and July was more than double the amount of all other months combined, the Supreme Court failed to evaluate the program's total payout versus total in transit. Comparing these two very different numbers evidences that not enough deposits were made to ease the transition away from the moratorium. This looks more like kneecapping tenant protections when only 10% of rental assistance has actually made it into the hands of the applicants. Claim number 3. Congress has provided nearly $50 billion in emergency rental assistance, a reasonable proxy of the moratorium's economic impact. Fucking-jection, Your Honor, based on week 35 of the Census Bureau Pulse Survey, which, disclaimer, should be assessed with scrutiny because of a high margin of error in the data collection methodology, specifically the sample selection of survey respondents that may or may not be an accurate representation of the total number of tenants who are likely to be evicted, is still reason to suspect that the rent money allocated to at least some states is not enough to cover the aggregate amount of tenants' back rent to their landlords. To quickly break down my own methodology here, I started with the total number of households who were reportedly behind on rent per state, by 5,700, which is the estimated amount of back rent owed by individual tenants, compliments of Moody Analytics. With the total estimated outstanding rent owed at the state level, I calculated the difference in this number and the actual dollar amount allocated to each state for rent and rent arrears from the ERA 1 and 2 program. To get to the fucking point here, it wasn't rocket science to estimate the budgetary shortfalls in the federal rental assistance programs. But to err on the side of caution, let's cross-reference our numbers with the National Apartment Association, whose members own roughly 10 million rental units and recently sued the federal government for back rent, claiming that the CDC moratorium caused an aggregate loss of $26.6 billion to landlords over a 16-month period. There are 43 million occupied rental units in this country. If members of the National Apartment Association make up 25% of all rental housing stock, and the outstanding rent accrued from these tenants alone makes up over half of the total federal rental assistance money, I'd say Congress undershot their budget. It's likely the case that no think tank, analytics firm, or government survey system has actually captured the full scope of the eviction crisis. But that's not the tenants' fault. Of course, the majority of pulse survey participants who are on the cusp of eviction don't have confidence that they'll stay sheltered in place. Why would they? This legal body believes in upholding the imbalance of tenant and landlord relationships and the subsequent exploitation of tenancy that has led to extreme wealth disparities along the lines of race, gender, and religion. From which point they argue the merits of irreparable harm to the landlord and not at all about the ramifications to the tenant. Considering that the House is currently in recess and cannot pass emergency legislation, and even if there were, it would be highly unlikely to pass any congressional authorization for a new moratorium without having 2/3 majority support in the Senate. And a couple obstructionists largely as Democrats are not in favor of removing the filibuster. Economic recovery has been just as delayed as the goddamn rental assistance payout, and it should come as no surprise that the same congressional body refusing to enact emergency measures to stop evictions have also opted to end unemployment benefits this month, which could lead to even more non-payment evictions. The current social, political, and economic conditions continue to parallel with the Great Depression, which means history might really be repeating itself. If the government is emulating their same old tricks, maybe we should follow suit with the actions taken by the affected masses during this same time period. That's right, comrades. This final segment is all about the commies, baby. Let's go. The 1930s unemployment councils of the USA stemmed from a massive organization effort within the Communist Party for the purposes of mobilizing unemployed workers in preparation for class warfare against capitalism. This national movement was derived from the Unemployment Council of New York, who held a meeting in March 1921 to address the country's unemployment epidemic. This meeting was attended by local agencies of organized labor, including delegates from the American Federation of Labor and the Industrial Workers of the World. The official slogan, "Fight and Live, Worker Compensation," was used as a rallying cry during these New York meetings, symbolizing the party's collective agenda for unemployment relief through public works, as well as subsidized affordable housing for all workers. Outreach initiatives to expand participation among local residents were achieved through the forming of neighborhood units called Councils of Action. The ultimate goal was to build a national coalition of neighborhoods unified as the Workers' Unemployment Council of America. The Great Depression spurred the efforts of the Communist Party's trade union, Unity League, advancing the slogan "Fight, Don't Starve" to form a separate, broader network of affected masses to join the fight against capitalism. On July 4th and 5th of 1930, the newly formed Unemployed Councils of the USA held its first convention in Chicago, with over 1,300 delegates in attendance. The Unemployed Councils of the USA were made up of local groups called Committees of Action, and were organized at the electoral precinct or ward level to form a City Unemployed Council. The City Unemployed Council of smaller towns were to be additionally combined to form county councils. City and county councils were to elect delegates to state and national unemployed council bodies. In the book Poor People's Movements, Why They Succeed, How They Fail, Francis Fox Piven and Richard Cloward argue that the unemployed councils and their radical tactics ultimately helped many people suffering in the Great Depression. In organizing mass resistance to evictions, the unemployed councils would lead small bands of unemployed individuals to use strong-arm tactics to prevent authorities from tossing people and their belongings into the streets, which resulted in 77,000 evicted people being restored to their homes in New York City alone. In January 1931, UC members gathered in Washington, D.C. to form a mass protest demanding Congress pass a federal unemployment insurance bill. These efforts included a door-to-door canvassing campaign to collect petition signatures. The paper organization Unemployed Committee for the National Hunger March was formed to coordinate the first National Hunger March in Washington, D.C. It was a more organized approach to the party's collective demands for federal unemployment insurance and other programmatic objectives, like enacting a 7-hour workday, establishing a union wage pay scale for unemployed workers, payment of a soldier's bonus to veterans of World War I, and to end discrimination against Black American and foreign-born workers. This transformation didn't happen because politicians had an abrupt change of heart for the health and well-being of the subaltern classes. They were pushed, and out of fear of losing their position of power, they conceded to the rising popularity of social welfare programs, including the National Unemployment Insurance Program that's part of the Social Security Act of 1935. The future seems bleak, but the only way to reignite a successful movement centered around workers and housing rights tomorrow is to join an active organization today. So many brilliant, talented people are devoted to this movement, and it's often a thankless job that takes energy and fortitude. We all have a role to play in this fight, so if you're able, and you're doing it for the right reasons, go to that meeting. I promise you it will be the best decision that you make, and you'll make so many friends. You'll wish that you had joined sooner. That being said, thank you for tuning in to this episode of Housing News, and we'll see you next time.